So, traditional Jewish, Christian, or Muslim.
To understand atheist and agnostic.
You gave us a really tough topic this week, Preston.
I think it's a really fascinating topic. You actually got to crack open books to get the best material here.
And we know I don't do that on
the Holy Watermelon Podcast.
I do sometimes, but sometimes there's not a lot of time to research.
Yeah.
So what are we talking about today? After alluding to something difficult in the soft, alluding to something hard in the soft opening. That was really bad. That's a euphemism, which is different from
a Euhemerism.
A Euhemerus. Oh boy,
wow, that was bad.
Yeah, but that's why you listen to
the whole.
Kidding. I'll save that. I'll spare everyone. Yeah. So today we're talking about Euhemerism.
Yeah. So what if Zeus was a real guy? Wouldn't that be wild?
After trying to find out if he was a real guy or not, I feel let down.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean,
he didn't turn into a goose.
But a lot of the people
or swan
that are worshipped link back to someone that was real, even the first Buddha, right?
Yeah.
So it's just so old, it's impossible to.
Yeah, that's definitely the big part of the problem there. So on the island of Crete, on Mount Euctus, there is said to be the final resting place of Zeus. According to some, if you look at the mountain just right, it looks like a bearded dude's head.
Wow.
So that's honestly probably where the story comes from. But what if Zeus actually was a real person who died there? That'd be something,
That
right?
would be something.
If it could be proven.
If it could be proven. I mean, much newer religions have that problem. And
yeah. I think it's interesting. And so Euhemerus was this guy who believed things like that. Euhemerism is the opposite of etiological mythology, which is, of course, stories on how things came to be that are just stories and entirely contrary to scientific knowledge.
Like the first chapter of Genesis.
Sure. Or like even later into the book, the story on the value of the rainbow to the Noahite covenant. It's just a etiological myth, putting value on a thing and why it's there relative to your religious values, which of course, no scientific value at all.
Right.
So Euhemerism is generally understood as a way of interpreting mythology as having originated with real life people and events, which I think is pretty interesting, trying to figure out where these stories really come from. A lot of them, for sure, probably even most of them, are anthropomorphizing various natural phenomena like sky gods, lightning gods, fertility gods, whatever. Not going to be real people almost every single time.
What? Apollo's not real?
But some of them maybe were. Some of them could have been real people who were really great at something, and then they evolved into what we see as basically akin to Catholic saints today, and then eventually morphed into full-on gods. We got a lot of history we can't account for.
How is Euhemerism different from deification?
So there's some strong overlap here.
Okay.
A lot of the time, when people talk about Euhemerism for Zeus, they do talk about apotheosis, and I want to talk more about apotheosis in our next episode.
Okay. Just a little teaser. Now I'm curious. But
yeah, so this is, as our title may suggest, on where did these gods maybe potentially come from. And then next time we'll talk about how you could.
Okay, so the book I read last year, How Jesus Became God by Bart Ehrman, would be more next episode.
I think so. Yeah.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So tell me more about Euhemerus.
Euhemerus was a collector and teller of stories. He was kind of like a court jester almost, not with like the humiliation that comes with that role that you usually see in popular culture today, but he collected stories and told stories in the royal court of Macedonia, which is pretty cool. Not everybody gets that kind of role. Sometimes there's some overlap with this jester role with the wizard. If the wizard, who is supposed to be this divinely inspired courtier who is supposed to give advice to the king when the king isn't receiving revelation from whatever gods they might worship, there's some serious work to be done there. Sometimes, if he's not taken seriously, there's some overlap with the jester role. I don't think this Euhemerus was thought of as a prophet in the court at all. In fact, a lot of people in the area and people who were worried about the authority that he held in this court would call him an atheist.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Because he thinks all the gods were real people.
Yeah, instead of gods.
Yeah.
He stripped away all of their divinity in the way that he tried to puzzle out their mythology. Interesting. And so he was in the royal court of Cassander around 300 BCE. So kind of like right around the sweet spot of Greek history, I think. Not when all the Greeks were telling stories about, but when they were telling the really good stories, shortly before they were completely demolished by the Romans. So Euhemerus believed that the old gods were real people, as we had said, and that after their deaths, they became the subjects of increasingly fantastical tales. So he expected that many of the gods were actually kings of old kingdoms, including Zeus, king of Crete.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, that's a very plausible hypothesis.
So very, very hard to disprove.
But it makes sense that whatever heroes or kings you tell stories about and you add something and it snowballs and all of a sudden it goes from...
Yeah, the telephone game, when you're dealing with mass illiteracy over thousands of years, those stories are going to get great.
I just watched 2 weeks ago Snowpiercer with Chris Evans. Mm-hmm. And I think you had seen the TV show. So
I'd seen trailers for the TV show. So yeah, I've got an idea.
But they deify the train guy.
Oh, yeah.
But after the movie takes place over 17 years. And by the end, Wilford or whatever his name is becomes this god.
Right. So the big difference that we're going to see here between the discussion of apotheosis and Euhemerism is that apotheosis is always looking forward on the hope that a person that we know exists, like you or me, can become a god. Whereas Euhemerism is hypothetical backwards, that here we have a figure that is worshipped, and hypothetically, they were human at some point. Mm. Or occasionally, sometimes we'll see manifestations of Euhemeristic thought that will explain away this god into a natural phenomenon. So Euhemerus had a whole bunch of ideas on all the gods that he had to deal with. Really, none of them got any critical acclaim. His ideas were not popular.
Yeah. Everything I found was he thought Zeus was a real person, but there's nothing that proves it. I was like, well, I can write one sentence in these notes.
Yeah. Yeah. He doesn't get a whole lot of credit, but the idea that he worked with is workable in a lot of scenarios. There's a lot of gods that maybe they were real people. And so we're going to explore that a little bit.
All right. Also, we found some situations that may be historical as opposed to mythological.
In Eusebius's preparation of the Gospel, 10th book, Clement gave dates for Heracles. Many of you may know him as Hercules. I don't think even Kevin Sorbo knows that his real name is Heracles.
That's an old actor. You don't hear that name anymore.
I mean, he is active on Twitter and he is a douche canoe.
Oh, that's too bad.
Yeah.
You mean X?
Sure. Still not on board with that name change.
Fair. It's a bad name change.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Carry on.
The legendary mortal son of Zeus. The Romans knew him as Hercules. The French gave that name to us in English. And Clement says that not only was he for sure a king in Argos, he gives us a specific date.
Oh.
So I'm going to read this segment that we have from Preparation of the Gospel, written by Eusebius. From the reign of Heracles in Argos to the deification of Heracles himself and of Asclepius, there are comprised 38 years, according to Apollodorus, the chronicler.
Mm-hmm.
And from that point to the deification of Castor and Pollux, 53 years, and somewhere about this time was the capture of Troy. So this gives us an approximate date for the death of Heracles at 1226 BCE.
Wow. That's pretty impressive.
Unfortunately, I don't know where he gets his numbers. So it's hard to fact check.
Yep. Yeah, we need a Greek scholar.
Yeah, that would help. So several kings claim descent from Heracles in Argos, Corinth, Sparta, and Macedonia. And I mean, this is pretty common all throughout world history, that there's this ethnogenesis mythology that we get where everyone's like, this great culture hero? Yeah. The king of our town is a descendant to his.
Everyone likes this guy? Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Well, even William the Conqueror in England said, oh, yeah, no, I'm totally descended from those fellas in your Christian Bible. Don't worry about it.
Don't worry about it. If anyone follows up a sentence with don't worry about it, you should worry about it.
Right?
I just feel like that's a really good life lesson.
Yeah. So, Latter-day Saint tradition, we worry a lot about connecting ourselves through our family trees as far back as we can possibly go. I've got myself eventually connected to English royalty, which gets me connected to William the Conqueror, who apparently is connected to Jewish royalty, all the way back to Adam, because the Bible takes care of the rest.
Yeah, I mean, I've done that. Mine doesn't go back that far. My husband, their sound guy, his does go back that far too. I forget which royal he hits that goes all the way back to biblical times, but at some point you have to be a little bit skeptical.
Right?
Even when he gets back as far, he has like some Viking kings in his all the way back to the year 100. I'm like,
Could be legit.
I mean, at least like kept records for royalty, but that doesn't mean your family kept good records. Like, there's a lot of room for error.
There's so many stages in this tracking where people could have just made stuff up. Yeah.
Anyway, one day we'll do a 23andMe and see how Viking he actually is, and if it's 0% that we know someone lied.
Well, Viking is actually a job description, right?
That's true.
And being of Scandinavian descent, I'd say it's pretty likely. All right.
Story time with Preston.
So normally our story times, they're pretty monologous, where I'm the only one talking.
Oh.
I need you to play the part of Phaedrus for this.
Oh, okay. Can I get some acting notes?
I think you're already in character for Phaedrus, if that helps.
Okay.
So this is a minor abridgment from a small section of Plato's Phaedrus. Phaedrus and Socrates are walking along the river, and they begin talking about a mythical tale of Boreas, god of the north wind, and Orithia.
Okay.
All right, there we go.
So, Socrates, isn't it from around this part of the Ilyssus that Boreas carried Orithia away?
So they say.
Could this be the spot? The stream is lovely and clear, just right for girls to play nearby.
No, it's a few hundred yards downstream, where you cross to get to Agri. I think there's even an altar to Boreas there.
I hadn't noticed it, but tell me, Socrates, do you really believe the legend?
Actually, it would be good for me to reject it. Then I could tell a clever story. That a gust of the north wind blew her over the rocks where she was playing with Pharmacia. And after she was dead, people could say that she had been carried off by Boreas.
Finn.
Yeah.
End scene.
We have more voice acting written by some faithful listeners on our Patreon. If you enjoyed that.
If you enjoyed that, there's even better voice work on our Patreon.
Since we actually practiced for that one.
And it was quite a thrilling script.
Yeah, I had fun with that. This was just tweaking a little bit for brevity and clarity, the words of Plato, who also does write everything as a player's audio drama, or however you want to interpret it. It's kind of fun. In contrast to the task of hypothesizing the humanity of the old gods, Plato's style of Euhemerism here gives us a way that the story may kind of be true if you take the god out of it, which I think is interesting.
Yeah.
That instead of this man Boreas carrying off this woman, she just was blown into the sea.
I mean,
it's a tragedy either way for the people left behind.
I mean, yeah, and really problematic if Boreas is still around. We probably shouldn't write that one off as a myth if Boreas is literally committing crimes. But it's fine.
Well, I mean, we have the person of Zeus. Almost all the stories of Zeus, I really hope there's not as much truth behind them.
I mean, I was a very well-behaved Zeus on Halloween.
Were you?
Maybe not put my husband. But I was the swan.
Wonderful.
Norse mythology has some Euhemerism in it.
Well, kind of.
Kind of. Nothing's proven.
I mean, to say there's Euhemerism in mythologies feels a little bit weird, but to Euhemerize mythologies feels like the thing that we're doing.
Perfect. So that's what I meant to say.
Perfect.
In the 13th century CE, Snorri Sturluson composed the Prose Edda, retelling the tales of the Aesir, or the Asgardians. And in his Christian context, Snorri spoke of the Aesir as Asian kings.
Yeah, bold move. I think that's from what we call lazy etymology. As Aesir sounds like Asia, definitely they were Asian. I think he's onto something that the Aesir that are described in the Eddas might have been real people. Hard to say for sure. It's all lost to prehistory.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's definitely nonsense to say the Aesir were Asians.
It is possible that of the many names given to Odin, some might represent historical persons who have been swallowed up in the identity of the king of Asgard, who is said to disguise himself and walk among men.
I think it's possible. In fact, I would say it's even probable that some of the
Odin
stories are definitely... Because he never says, hey, by the way, I'm Odin at the end. It's just like, no, this dude walked into my life, gave this name, and then did this thing and then walked out of my life. A lot of them are probably legit stories that are falsely tied to Odin.
I kind of like that idea of like,
right?
A good deed, hopefully.
Yeah.
Or even a bad deed you're blaming someone on.
Sure.
Blaming on someone, that you think it's a god, even though it's never said to be Odin. I like that.
Right? That reminds me of another weird Mormon tradition. So very often you'll hear stories when you get into weird folklore of people who just show up and do this nice little thing and then just disappear. And this story gets built up and like, oh yeah, and they were the three Nephites. A set of fellows described in the Book of Mormon as people who were given the gift that they would never die, but they would continue to live on the earth and help people out. And it sounds nice, but it also seems a lot less likely.
It may be a stretch to say that Thor, the personification of thunder in name and manner, is anything else, but a hypothesis claims that he was a man whose true name was replaced by that of the thunder he mimicked naturally in laughter as well as in rage.
Just have this wicked dude who gets a lot of things done.
Just a nickname. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Jesus gave the same nickname to two of his apostles. John is one of them.
Okay.
So we'll look at his top three dudes. The three dudes who get to see all the coolest stuff in
John,
the Gospels.
Peter.
We got Rocky, and Jimmy and Johnny Thunder.
Wow.
Yeah.
What?
And so there's some guesses on why they were given this name in all kinds of literature since then, that maybe they were pretty great zealots and caused a lot of mayhem wherever they went.
Which one's Rocky?
Peter.
Okay. It's like James John.
Because Peter means rock. Derivatively.
Jimmy and Johnny Thunder. Where's the thunder come from?
It's still a mystery. But
what's the
popular hypothesis is that it comes from them being troublesome.
But what do we see in the Bible? It doesn't say James and John Thunder.
Right. It's Boanerges is the way we see it in most versions of the English Bible. It's probably a severe butchering of Aramaic or Hebrew B'nai Rajesh, the sons of thunder, that they together were the sons of thunder.
Oh.
Yeah.
That sounds pretty badass.
Right? So maybe they were actually totally mellow and their dad was the troublemaker.
Maybe.
I don't know.
You should start a band called the Sons of Thunder.
Somebody might have beaten me to it.
Maybe. That sounds like a great band name.
Right?
Here's one that's actually agreed upon by many scholars, is Gilgamesh, the lovely Sumerian epic. I know my brother had to study it in school and he hated it. I think it's just very long. Did you have to do Gilgamesh?
No.
Okay, yeah, that surprises me.
No, I've picked away at it occasionally, casually, just because of interest. I think I had to deal with one section of the epic for a course in university, but the whole thing, no.
So it is widely agreed that Gilgamesh was a Sumerian king in Uruk during the early dynastic period from, this is very old, 2900 to 2900 to 2300 BCE.
So they agree on a wide window
of when he existed, yes, but they agree that he did exist. So that's kind of cool. He was worshipped as a god in later periods. King Utu-Hengal, man, when you only ever read words,
right?
Adopted Gilgamesh as his patron deity in the 21st century BCE.
Okay, so possibly as little as 300 years after his death.
Yeah.
Assuming he was a real person and this window is
as accurate as it can be when it's 5,000 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, and it's mostly speculative, but to come up with a window, you've got some
tent poles?
Sure, I was going to say pylons,
okay.
which is less good. So. There's something that this framework is built on.
Okay.
But it's cool.
Yeah. I'm interested in the notes you've written for the next section because I actually found a lot of, not people, but events in the Bible that would be euhemeristic.
Sure.
Okay. But
let's do that before this.
Okay. So these aren't people, but these are, again, event. Well, no, there is one person that, again, nothing is proven, but there's some pretty strong hypotheses on.
Sure.
So we'll start as close to the beginning as we can get with Exodus. I guess this is Jewish as opposed to Christian, but Judeo-Christian, Abrahamic.
Abrahamic feels like the good umbrella label here.
Actually, yeah, I guess a lot of these are Abrahamic. Okay, so while the biblical Exodus narrative may lack any historical evidence, there is a potential connection to the late Bronze Age events around 1200 BCE, and historical sources suggest the presence of Canaanites in Egypt. Traders and migrants from Canaan also frequented Egypt during periods of drought, aligning with biblical accounts. Though most Canaanites assimilated into Egyptian society, some chose not to stay, as noted in documents we have from Egypt. So there's no direct evidence linking these events to the Exodus narrative. It's possible that a group inspired by a charismatic leader like Moses undertook a 40-year journey that should have taken 2 weeks.
So the Exodus story does explain why it took a lot longer than 2 weeks.
It's probably not possible that a group took the 40-year journey, but possible that a group took a journey. maybe it only took them the 2 weeks, back to what they remembered as the promised land, or potentially what they had heard of
Sure.
in stories as the promised land. Okay, but why did it take 40 years?
So
I've literally mapped the route.
yeah, no, it's easy. You can do it. You can punch it into Google Maps and it can say you could walk here.
It in 2 weeks. Yeah.
That's no problem at all. So, so when they got out of Egypt to a place where they could set up camp and feel safe that they weren't going to get overtaken by the Egyptians, they sent spies into the land where they intended to go to see if that was going to be a safe move. They sent several spies. Then they all came back, and all but 2 of them are like, this place is terrible. It's full of giants. Everything is awful. We don't want to go. And so the people are like, well, this is awful. 2 of them were faithful, Caleb and Joshua. And they told the truth that this land is actually pretty great. There's a lot of open spaces. There's a handful of cities. Some of them are not friendly. Some of them are friendly. But it's great. And so because everybody was just being really pessimistic about this whole escape plan from Egypt, then they just decided, okay, we're not going. And Moses is like, well, you can't go back. So we're going to stay here in the desert
Until
all of you are dead.
Or change your mind?
No, it was a
Death.
hard commitment of, you don't get to go. You will die. And when the last of you is dead, then we'll go.
Oh, what?
And so Joshua, one of those 2 spies, was the oldest kind of by a lot by the time they went into the Holy Land.
Oh, but he still got to see it. Cute story.
Yeah.
This one's a person, King David. So the historical existence of King David, known, of course, for defeating Goliath and ruling Israel, has been debated for centuries. However, in 1993, the Tel Dan Stele, a broken stone slab discovered in northern Israel, provided archaeological evidence supporting David's historicity. Dating to the late 9th or early 8th centuries BCE, this inscription on the slab recognized a victory of a king of Damascus and includes the phrase House of David.
Cool.
Well, that's kind of cool.
Yeah. It feels like we're moving a little bit away from Euhemerism, but it's cool archaeology. David wasn't a god.
I guess so.
He was a king that everyone was so sure existed. And then we're like, we actually don't have a lot of evidence. And then we found some. But it took us a while to find that evidence.
I mean, in that time, he went into the realm of myth, maybe not deified.
He was definitely a mythical king, as far as important to the foundation of this nation. But yeah, it felt more like a legendary character than a true character for a while. And so we've only solved this 30 years ago.
Plague!
The plagues of Egypt. These are actually really interesting.
Yeah. I found them super interesting. So some historians argue that the biblical plagues are allegorical.
So there's definitely allegorical value to them. Most of these plagues have a connection where it would seem like they're built to attack a specific Egyptian god who would have been popular.
Right.
It's entirely possible that is actually a rather new way of telling the story. TBD.
TBD. Compelling evidence suggests that they may have actually occurred. I'm guessing not all of them, but some of them. The plagues affecting the ancient city of Pi-Ramses in the Nile Delta during Ramses II reign find some support in natural explanations. Environmental changes, possibly due to rising temperatures or drought, altered the Nile's color, triggering a blight that affected frogs and insects. The ensuing insect increase led to livestock diseases. The thunderstorm of fire is likely linked to the Thera eruption in 1628 BCE, evidenced by ash deposits found in the Nile region.
Yeah, so the only trouble we have there is that most people, when they try and tell this story of when this happened, this year doesn't look good. But as far as when the Israelites left Egypt, assuming that that is a historical event, which most, well, not to say most, an awful lot of people say, no, that's just hokum. It's awfully difficult to prove. the year that it should have happened, according to most people, is pretty distant from 1628 BCE. But
What year would it have been?
a lot of people like to stick a little closer to 1300 BCE. Generally, I think.
But they could have borrowed an older story.
And it's entirely possible that they've completely lost track of the actual chronology of their history.
Yeah, right.
There's a lot of reasons why the timing is not the most important part of the story.
Well, this is where I got so frustrated studying this question. As I would like look something up and be like, that's cool. And then I cross-check it and they'd be like, there's no proof. And I'd be like, ugh.
Well, especially if you want to put specific dates on things, because the geological record, archaeology, deals a lot with dating things. And sometimes the dates don't match up with what you're expecting at all. It's frustrating.
This was another fun one. The Tower of Babel is a story in Genesis used to explain the diverse languages that we have around the world. There is a debate on whether the tower exists, but the tower appears in other cultures, including Sumerians and the Toltecs. The prevalent theory links it to the Etemenanki, a ziggurat built by King Nabopolassar of Babylon around 1610 BCE for the deity Marduk.
Marduk.
Marmaduke? Is it Marduk a Marvel character?
So an awful lot of the old gods did get an interpretation included into the Marvel comics.
Amazing. Isn't he the guy you were for Halloween? Is that who am I thinking?
No, that's MODOK.
MODOK. That's who I'm thinking of. This reconstruction, over 300 feet tall, was attributed by King Nebuchadnezzar to a much earlier period, potentially aligning with the Babylonian rule over the Hebrews.
So there's a lot of parts to this story of the Tower of Babel, or Babel. I've heard both plenty. I don't have a strong preference on the pronunciation. I know somebody out there in Radio Land will.
I mean, Babel's fun from the word Babel.
Right. And also probably doesn't match the Sumerian language or the Old Hebrew very well. Or any other culture that might want to talk about an ancient tower.
I'm pretty sure in the other Jesus Christ Passion musical that's not Jesus Christ Superstar. Shoot, what's it called? Anyway, I'm pretty sure they say Babel, which...
Yeah, both get used a lot.
Oh, now I'm going to be mad.
So there's...
I have to look up the musical. I'm so sorry, but carry on with your...
There's some real trouble using the ideological myth of why are there so many languages on this planet and pinning it on what is, for the biblical narrative, relatively recent history, and this tower that is supposed to be in the biblical version of the story so tall to reach heaven, when it for sure does not compete with the tallest structures of today.
I mean, honestly, the tallest structures of today scare me.
Sure. You can go all the way up and all of a sudden the air is so thin that you're having a hard time.
And like the amount that they move because they have to.
Yeah.
Like that just scares me.
Sure. So the value of that story for me has got nothing to do with the language nonsense, but so the mission, as far as it's worded in there, is we're going to build this building that's going to get us to heaven. They built a temple, and presumably without actual divine authority, and thus smite.
Smoted.
Yeah.
The musical is Godspell.
I have heard of that.
It's really
I've never
good.
seen it. Okay.
There's a movie of it made much like... So it actually came out right around the same time as Jesus Christ Superstar. Two people independently made musicals on the last days of Jesus. And then they were turned into movies roughly the same time too in the 70s.
All right.
Our good friend Jack was also in Godspell as Jesus.
I feel like I knew that.
Yeah, when we did our research, yes.
Yeah.
I can see why someone who's not as weird about musicals as I am, that would...
Yeah. yeah, I don't pay a whole lot of attention to musicals.
And I was explaining some weird musical thing to a friend just yesterday, and she's like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Fine.
I want to go back to the Exodus just a little bit.
Sure.
It's in my head right now, and I have to dump it out of my head. Is the parting of the Red Sea. So there's a lot of discussion on, was it the Red Sea?
Well, I mean, we talked about this a long time ago, the Reed Sea.
Yeah. So I watched a documentary a little while ago. Time is a weird thing. It was not in the last year. That talks about how this probably did happen, maybe. But it would have been like, here's a shallow lake that's just super reedy, gets the name the Reed Sea. And the wind blew, as described in the biblical narrative, to the point that it did part the waters in this very shallow lake. I don't know if that's actually plausible, but it's this Euhemeristic practice of trying so hard to find an explanation for this story.
There's some place in the world, and I'm embarrassed I don't remember it better now. Had I known you were going to tell this story. No, I follow a lot of travel stuff.
Sure, as you do.
As I do. And it was a video of this road somewhere in the world, and you can only travel it at low tide because other than that, there's an ocean over it.
That makes sense.
Which also stresses me out, just like really tall buildings.
Sure.
Because if you're, and it's not a short road. It is not a short road. So if you're on it at the wrong time and you watch the tide start coming in. So I wonder if it wasn't something like that where a natural earth mound.
Maybe.
And at the right time of day.
So the great thing about the tides is that we've gotten to the point where they're pretty predictable.
I know, but what if you were just that jerk that was like, I'm going through, or like traffic was slow, or...
That's fair. If you screw something up and you hold up 100 people behind you for an extra 2 hours,
like
you're putting lives in danger.
Your car breaks down. You get a flat tire. Like there's so many things that could go wrong. And you're right. Like we're pretty good at timing this stuff. You're not wrong. But like I would want to be the first one on it.
Sure.
And the first one off. I would not want to be on the end of it. Because then you have all those cars in front of you.
Right.
Where something could go wrong. Or something could go wrong with your car.
Right.
At least if you're first, everyone can push you. Because they have a vested interest.
Yeah.
Now I got to look that up too, but.
That's great. So I did actually find some other things, going back to things we talked about Odin, that in the 16th century, Odin was considered officially the first king of Sweden.
Okay.
We're back into actual Euhemerism again. And I mean, I feel like this is very much like Hercules of, we want to have just unofficial documents for some sort of authority claim. Certainly not authentic, but some sort of authority claim that makes the guy who set up our kingdom the guy. And so I think it's kind of interesting that there's a lot of things like that. And something that I had thought about a little bit when I was reading the Eddas that makes a little bit of sense in that context, but I don't think we have any evidence at all to back it up. But I've found that other scholars also agree with this, that the Vanir were the older gods. Mm-hmm. They're mostly nature gods, that sort of thing. And then the Aesir came in. And that is almost certainly a representation of new people moving into the area and saying, you have to worship our gods.
Interesting.
Or maybe, just maybe, for Euhemeristic argument, you will worship us now. I think that's fascinating.
I think it's interesting too.
Yeah. No proof at all.
No,
but it's a
that's
fun
why
idea.
This was like, again, the hardest thing to research.
Yeah, it's you
it's
can't
just theories,
back up a lot of this stuff.
It's just,
It's a hypothetical science, the worst kind of science.
and just like my desire to be accurate in this was just like, there is no accuracy, just stories.
Yeah. One, that's so much of life is just storytelling, right?
It's true. So you have this hot take in the notes that I'm excited to hear about. Preston wrote, can Euhemerism be useful in discussing the Christian God? The short answer is no.
Yeah, so I was talking to somebody in my office about what this episode was going to be about. And, the brief summary of what is Euhemerism. The idea that the God used to be an actual dude. And the question came up, well, that sounds like Christianity. And I feel like because of what Euhemerism is, in that it is the hypothetical rather than a more sure thing, that it doesn't really fit onto Christianity specifically.
Well, and this
very
comes
well.
back to my earlier question of deification versus Euhemerism,
Right.
where I'd say Jesus is deification. God the Father, I'd say is, I would say is entirely made up.
Right.
All knowing, all seeing, pretty hard to map that onto anyone,
Right.
which is why I was actually transcribing our Greek episode because I texted you some questions that kind of came up of like, they thought one all-powerful God was ridiculous because how could he do all these different things? Which is why the polytheism lasted so long, because you have one who does the rain and one who does the sun and one who looks after war. And so, yeah, I can see, again, God the Father, can't map that onto any one person, and then Jesus would be next episode.
Right. Yeah, that's more apotheosis material than Euhemerism.
Right.
Because the historical person of Jesus isn't hypothetical so much. It's argued, sure. There's lots of people who think there was no historical Jesus. But saying he's there, we've gone past hypothetical. We've got documentation that claims that he is a real person. And it's as authoritative as you want to believe it is. But that's the important distinction there. Christians are happy to say, yes, he was immortal. And those are the people who believe in him. Euhemerism is, I'm going to say, fairly categorically rejected by the people within that tradition. If you worship Odin, you have no interest in believing that he's an amalgamation of different people.
Right. Though Christianity wouldn't like to hear that Jesus is an amalgamation of different people. Just
Fair.
that he was one real person.
Yes. There is a longer, trickier answer than the simple no. And it has to be expanded to all of Abrahamic faiths. That the great Abrahamic God, the El Elyon, or whatever you might want to call him.
Yahweh came up when I was transcribing that we had heard it pronounced Yahweh at the time of that recording recently. And I was like,
Yeah, so El Elyon is the god of the heavens and the mountains. And his son Yahweh was the god of armies and storms, according to most of Israel's neighbors. They recognize these gods, sometimes worship them,
so
often
pre-monotheism.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Monotheism.
So Yahweh just lasted.
Yahweh was the one God worshipped by the Israelites that survived the Babylonian exile. We talked about this a little bit in our previous episode on Zoroastrianism. Before the Israelites had to live with Zoroastrians, they had no interest in monotheism.
Yeah.
And you're going to have people who don't like that idea. Most of the people who don't like that idea have a vested interest in monotheism.
Fair. Sorry, I interrupted, but
Yeah. So, like we said at the beginning, fertility gods, sky gods, really hard to map onto specific individual people, or even map that archetype onto a culture hero. It doesn't really work so great. But after putting some serious thought into it as a believer, I think that at best we could hypothesize and guess that El Elyon could have been a title conferred upon a minor king of a mountain village after a great conquest of another place. It's like, look at me. not only am I your king, I am your god king. And I mean,
Honest
we've
little
seen that
mountain.
happen. So
Yeah.
sure, why not? It's possible,
It's something I'd like to do one day.
right? Conquer a small town and be worshipped as a god king.
Yeah, absolutely.
I
yeah.
get you. But really, I think any further detail just becomes fantasy.
I mean, it's a tough subject.
And it's a really tricky field. And the authors who are putting material out into this are opening themselves up to a lot of argument, which, I mean, that's fun. So good for them.
Yeah, good for them.
We'll track some down and
Yeah, my brain's just...
we'll put them in the Discord for anyone who's interested.
Yeah, my brain is going. This is a tough one. I'm excited for next week because I feel like deification is going to be way easier.
On how you can become a god.
Well, like I said, I would like to. So I'm sure some of our listeners would like to.
Oh, sure.
And I think this is going to lead well into, we have a really cool guest coming up because L. Ron Hubbard was deified. Spoilers!
Yeah. Oh, good times. All right. Is there anything else we should say before we close out?
And now I'm good because this was tough. But I will say, because I've spoiled what's coming down the pipe in a couple weeks. 3 or 4 episodes. I don't know anymore.
Time is fuzzy.
Time is fuzzy and we pre-record. But join our Patreon. We have early release and we have bonus episodes and we have extended versions of our interviews, of most of our interviews. Yeah. So we had Frank McMahon on earlier this year. Very interesting. We have super cool guests coming up. So get on our Patreon. $5 Canadian a month. If you're one of our American listeners, that's basically free. And it helps us keep going and doing more cool stuff.
Yeah. Be sure to follow us on Facebook or Instagram, whichever you prefer. Get some great inter-episode knowledge that maybe you can share with your friends.
And of course, join our Discord to keep the conversation going. We answer questions, do listener requests, and just to have a really great community that shares the best memes.
We've also got merch.
Merch.
Check out our spread shop. It'll be in the links in the show notes, along with links to all of our socials and everything else.
Yeah.
Cool.
Hope to hear from you in the new year, dear listener.
Oh, we're already in the new year.
Then this year. Like over the course
of the year. Perfect. Sorry.
Wow.
Well, thanks for joining us.
Peace be with you. Judgers and over. Trying to say something nice to our congregants so I can become a god.